welcome back to People Do Want to Know podcast. I've been eagerly awaiting to share this episode with you as it features a real People Jew Want to Know. Today, you will hear me interview Bradley Tusk. Bradley Tusk is a venture capitalist, political strategist, philanthropist, and writer. He is the co-founder of Tusk Ventures, the world's first venture capital fund that invests solely in early-stage startups in highly regulated industries. He is also the founder of a political consulting firm called Tusk Strategies. Bradley's family foundation is funding and leading the national campaign to bring mobile voting to all U.S. elections. You heard that right, mobile voting, voting from your phone. Tusk Philanthropies also runs and funds anti-hunger campaigns that have led to the creation of policies and programs in 22 different states, helping to feed over 12.5 million people. Bradley is the author of multiple books, including a new one that I'm currently reading called Obvious in Hindsight. He hosts a tech and politics podcast called Firewall and is the co-founder of the Gotham Book Prize. As you will hear, we recorded this episode in his bookstore and podcast studio, P&T Knitwear. It's in Manhattan on the Lower East Side. Bradley is also a Columbia Business School professor. I've recorded all sorts of episodes, different lengths, different personalities, different topics. I won't say this very often, but this is one of the few episodes where the whole thing is worth listening to from start to finish, every minute. Bradley is a super badass person who is intelligent in a very robust set of topics. We cover everything from politics and tech lawsuits to the anti-Semitism on campus and finding purpose in your life. You'll hear pretty quickly that Bradley has a tremendous amount of knowledge on all sorts of topics, and he has strong and thoughtful opinions on those topics. If Bradley was willing to be on social media, he would 1000% be viral. He's one of those people where I want to know his opinion on everything because it's just so interesting to hear him speak. I learned of Bradley through a podcast that I listen to religiously called Invested by Olive. This podcast is run by Michael Eisenberg, who is another person I aspire to bring on the podcast. I'd never heard of Bradley until I listened to that episode, but it took me about 5 minutes to realize that this is a person I must bring onto my podcast if I can. Bradley, thank you to you and your team for the openness to come onto my podcast. And to the listeners, please enjoy this episode. Hey, Bradley, thanks so much for coming on People Do Want to Know podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
It's such a pleasure. Let's get right to it.
Okay.
Take us beyond your bio. How did you get to where you are today? And can you share more about some of your work and what's exciting to you right now?
I think I got to where I am primarily by starting off by disappointing my Jewish parents, right? So I went to law school as a very good Jewish boy should, and took out a bunch of debt to be able to pay for it, and had all kinds of offers to go work at law firms. But I knew myself well enough to know that I would be utterly fucking miserable if that was my life, and turned down these offers. This was back in 1999, but it was still it's still a decent starting salary today. It was like 130, 140 grand or whatever it was to go make $36,000 at the Parks Department, even though I had all of this debt that I was just kind of put off repaying for a while. Because it wasn't that I knew where it would all lead, but I knew the stuff that I liked and that I was good at. And I knew that I felt like if I was doing work that to me was intellectually engaging and felt meaningful in some way, and in a lot of ways, Parks Department felt incredibly meaningful because it's so tangible, right? You have 8.5 million New Yorkers, and if the parks are clean and safe, they have a higher quality of life, and if the parks are dirty and dangerous, they have a lower quality of life, and either you're delivering for them or you're not. And I couldn't have predicted all the twists and turns that my career would have taken, but I did have a general attitude in my 20s and the first half of my 30s where it was, I'm not going to worry about salary, I'm not going to worry about titles, I'm just going to try to get jobs where I can learn the most, work with the smartest people, and gain the most experience in whatever it is. And I think that even though that was sort of non-obvious to both my disappointed Jewish parents and a lot of other people, it made sense to me. And I think by pursuing it that way, I was able to get to where I am now.
That's awesome. You're working on a bunch of different projects now, including mobile voting. What are you excited about in this industry and in this time?
Yeah, there's a lot, right? So the two big philanthropic things we work on is mobile voting, and the basic thing there is we live in a world where every policy output is the result of a political input. Every politician makes every decision solely based on re-election and nothing else. Because of gerrymandering, the only election that matters is the primaries. Primary turnout is typically about 10%. who are they? The furthest left, the furthest right, or special interests. So as a result, we either get totally dysfunctional government like we see in Washington, or we get totally one-sided government, whether it's the city of San Francisco on the left or the state of Texas on the right. None of that is good, in my opinion. And so what mobile voting argues is if people could vote securely on their phones, turnout would go from 10% to 30%, 40%, whatever it is, and that would move everything towards the middle because politicians wouldn't be hostage to the extremes on both sides. I ran the campaigns about a decade ago or so to legalize Uber and ride sharing around the country. And the way that we won and beat the taxi industry was we were able to mobilize millions of our customers through the app, through their phones, to get them to advocate on our behalf to elected officials in every city and state all over the country. And it worked. We won. So I'm trying to see if we can make it possible to vote in the same way. So we've been building our own mobile voting technology that will be free and open source. Other thing is hunger. So we fund and run campaigns in state governments that would expand access to food in different ways. So universal school meals, breakfast after the bell, SNAP for seniors. The thesis that I have is that the hunger groups, the advocacy groups are lovely people, but in some ways being a lovely person and being good politically are sort of almost, binary opposites, right? And so they don't get that much done when it comes to passing legislation. And so my question was, if you put a real campaign behind these bills and you had lobbying and PR and polling and advertising and grassroots and really good campaign people like the people who work for me running it, could you pass these bills at a greater percentage? And the answer so far has been yes. So we've run 30 bills over the last 6 or 7 years, passed 24 of them. About 13 million more people now have access to food on a regular basis. And what we found is by spending about $6 million of my money on these types of campaigns, we were able to unlock about $2 billion in new government spending on hunger programs. So now we focus exclusively on universal school meals, running campaigns this year in Illinois, Ohio, South Carolina, Arkansas, and Pennsylvania.
I mean, you bring up an important point. The meals right now that are at school are disgusting.
Yes.
Those school meals are horrible. So this is really cool work. I'm so excited to learn more, and it's a real pleasure to have you on to pick your brain about some of these things.
Thanks for the chance to do it.
I want to mention to the listeners that we're currently in your free podcast studio at P&T Knitwear. How did you think to open this?
So I love books. I've written a couple of books. I read voraciously. During the pandemic, I started this thing with a friend of mine, Howard Wolfson, who might be a good guest, by the way, called the Gotham Book Prize, where we give out $50,000 each year to the best book published that year that's either set in New York City or about New York City. And I was really enjoying it and enjoying working with the jury and all these different authors and everything else. And, COVID was just wiping out retail in New York City. And it kind of hit me like, look, if you're going to do something like own a bookstore and do something kind of nice for New York, because no one really ever makes money running a bookstore that I can tell, do it now when the city really needs the jobs and really needs the help. Don't wait till you're 70 or whatever it is. And so basically as little thinking as that, we went around the city. I knew I wanted it to be either in the East Village or the Lower East Side. We found this location that we're sitting at right now, 180 Orchard Street, which is between Houston and Stanton, and decided that it would be an indie bookstore, a podcast studio that is free for anyone to use. So if you're listening to this and you need a place to record, or Margarita, if you need a regular place to record, just find us online, pntknitwear.com, and you can sign up and use it. We are an event space. Most evenings we have events with different authors and a cafe. And look, it's a terrible business. I lose tons of money doing it. But I do think that we are a real resource for the community and for the city. And because of this particular podcast, and the name of the store is worth telling, which is my family after World War II lived in the refugee camps in Germany for a couple of years, waiting for someone to sponsor them to come to either the U.S. or Israel or South America, or they'd go wherever they could. And finally, a cousin in Brooklyn sponsored them. And they came over here. And if you were an uneducated Jew, one place where you could always find work was in the garment business. And my grandfather and a guy named Mike Pudlow, who he knew from the refugee camps, put together just enough money to open up a 300-square-foot sweater store on Allen Street called P&T Knitwear. And my dad told me that, because he would work there when he was a kid, that, they would have empty box on the shelves to look like they had inventory. But eventually they did okay. And when I signed the lease for this place, I texted my dad and I said, where was that original store again? And he told me, it's literally one block over. He said, remind me of the name. And he wrote, P&T Knitwear, but you can't name a bookstore P&T Knitwear. So the minute my dad told me I couldn't name a bookstore P&T Knitwear, that became our name. One cool thing, if you get a chance to stop into the store and check it out, is we found a photo of the original store from 1952, and one of our interior walls is just a giant photo of the original. So it's cool to be able to honor my family in that way.
I'll actually have to step out after this and take a look because I don't think I've seen it yet.
Yeah, it's kind of by the bathroom and cafe.
Okay, cool. Well, when I think about you and the work that you've done, you've really dedicated your career to tackling unconventional problems in a highly regulated business. It feels like a very Jewish thing to me also, as a side note.
Okay.
What's a lesson you can give on risk?
I mean, two things. One is you can't get anything done without risk, right? Just anything hard, anything different, anything that takes people who currently benefit from a system and takes power away from them to give it to other people who you think are more worthy is really, really hard and really, really risky, and you will fail most of the time. I still fail on stuff that I do all of the time. So the first thing is, if you want to accomplish anything meaningful, you got to want to take risk. The second thing, though, and I tell my students this a lot, which is you kind of have to know yourself too, right? And there are some people who are natural risk takers, some people who are not. If it is in your nature and personality that you're comfortable taking risk, then you should go try to do some really big things. There are other people who are incredibly smart and talented and well-meaning and hardworking, but they don't have the stomach for it, right? And one is not inherently better or worse than the other. But I think that if you are the kind of person for whom risk keeps you up all night, you can't handle it, then don't do it, right? Because you're going to be miserable. So I think one is understand that big things take risk, and understand that you probably already know your personality for being honest enough with yourself to know whether or not you can handle the risk. And if the answer is yes to both, then go try to do real things.
Yeah. People do want to know, we'd say, have chutzpah.
Yeah, that's another way to put it.
Yeah. Thanks. And you mentioned your students. So I have a bunch of questions for you on this, because this is a very interesting topic for me. You teach at Columbia Business School, which is, year after year, Columbia is noted as the most anti-Semitic campus in the U.S. What do you find, especially now?
It's interesting, right? So I taught in the fall, and so October 7th happened, in the middle of the semester. And the business school is not on the main campus. It's up on 130th Street. And so I'm never really ever on the main campus because, I'm an adjunct professor, so I take the subway up there, I show up, I teach my class, and I go back to my regular life and work. And so I was trying to push my students a little bit on kind of like, hey, what's going on? What are you seeing? And it was one of two things. Either they genuinely were kind of disconnected from all of it because they're older, right? My students are typically 25 to 30 in most cases, or even older than that. So they're not sort of these sort of super young ideologues. They're not as influenced by just watching TikTok all day. They've usually had experience in the real world. They've already had a job. It's pretty rare, if ever, to go from college straight to business school. So they're much more mature. They're also physically not ever on the actual regular Columbia campus. So they mainly said, look, we don't know about it. We don't see it. We have nothing to do with it. Now, it's possible that's all true. It's possible they also understand that I am very strongly pro-Israel, and they were smart enough that if they didn't feel that way, to not speak up and say so, because, there was no reason to antagonize me, although I wouldn't have affected their grade one way or the other. But so I haven't seen much of it personally, but it is just as a New Yorker, as someone who's part of the Columbia faculty, as a Jew, it's incredibly distressing. And there's a new president at Columbia, and I'm at least on the email server that faculty get from her. And it does seem like, to her credit, she is really genuinely trying to do something about it. And in fact, a good friend of mine from Bloomberg World just became the COO of Columbia, and I know that he will definitely want to do stuff about this and will not tolerate this kind of work. And he was Mike Bloomberg's deputy mayor for operations, so this is the guy that ran the city of New York, Kaz Holloway, and he's not going to take shit from anybody. So the good news is I do think that you have some new leadership there that is committed to doing something about it. With that said, and maybe I just read too much of the New York Post, but it feels like you still see all of the time rallies or hate speech against Jews or other sort of actions that are against Jews happening in and around the Columbia campus, and that's incredibly distressing.
Yeah, and I mean, if I'm not mistaken, you have teenage kids, right?
I do have a 17-year-old and a 15-year-old.
I would love for you to share to this audience your opinion on what the hell's going on with Gen Z and also TikTok.
Yeah, so two things. So my kids, I have to say, I am pretty pleasantly surprised that they've been strongly pro-Israel, or at least not heavily influenced by the anti-Israel rhetoric and narrative that you tend to see kind of on the left, right? And among Gen Z, we're not particularly religious, but both kids, were bar mitzvahed, and I think understand to a certain extent, the significance of the existence of the state of Israel to their own lives, because I've been very clear with them that, I hope Jews can live in this country peacefully for a long time, but the history of the world suggests that will not be the case. We have not survived more than a couple hundred years in almost any society throughout history, and that's probably, in my view, going to happen here too, which means the only real difference is we now have somewhere to go, and that place has to be in existence, and it has to be safe, and it has to be secure for us to have that place to go. So from a purely selfish standpoint, it makes sense for them to be pro-Israel because it's a decent shot that in their lifetime they will need to move there. And I know this sounds a little fatalistic, and I hope to be wrong, but I sadly don't feel like I am. But look, they look at TikTok all day. They're 17 and 15, and they go to, a private school in Manhattan. That world tends to be very, very left-wing. And I think that they're able to sort of balance it because of the, what they're getting from me at home. But overall, look, Trump, who I'm not a fan of, but was right a couple of years ago while he was still president. He said we should ban TikTok. And that was absolutely right, because TikTok is owned by ByteDance, which is a Chinese company, which means it's effectively controlled by the Chinese government. And they control the algorithms that are right now being, in my view, very deliberately used to manipulate young people in the U.S. and all over the world to be anti-Semitic, to be anti-Israel, and also just to, I think what China's part of their goal is just to cause general political unrest in the U.S. It is in China's interest to have Trump back in office because they just would rather have the chaos and the instability that Trump has than sort of a more thoughtful foreign policy that Biden brings. And so simply, even by just making Biden's reelection harder for him through the use of TikTok, they're achieving their goals. The idea that we allow our kids to have a device that is in every one of their hands and pockets, the content that is controlled by the Chinese government, is insane. Trump should have actually followed through on his idea as opposed to just coming up with an idea and then doing nothing about it. Biden has dropped the ball completely on this. TikTok should be banned in this country immediately. I mean,
in the last 2 years, as a Ukrainian Jewish person, I feel like we're taking L after L.
Yeah, that's a tough combo.
And then going back to kind of the Colombia thing, I do think Colombia has had a reckoning, because I remember when the conflict first started, when the war broke out in Israel, there was this one Columbia professor who literally, I'm pretty sure, had a meltdown in the middle of the campus because he was so upset by what was going on with the students. And he said, I don't feel safe working here. I refuse to work here if this is how it's going to be. So going back to that, I really hope that they do something.
Yeah, me too. And to a certain extent, I mean, I think that if every decision you make is solely meant to appease radicals and extremes and sort of win popularity with the loudest sort of segments of the students over common sense and what's good for running a university and everything else, you're going to lose one way or the other. So you're either going to lose because you have totally run down the quality of your university, you're going to lose because you're going to expose, you don't need to see in things like the congressional hearings that took down Claudine Gay and Liz McGill. One way or another, you're going to lose. So I think that this sort of captive that universities seem to feel to the far left and to sort of the loudest groups of students, ultimately, even if they think it makes their life easier on a day-to-day level, ultimately they're just signing their own death warrant.
How did you even decide to teach, and what do you think your students have taught you?
Yeah, so it's the teaching thing wasn't, they actually kind of that one came to me. So I wrote my first book in 2018. It's called The Fixer, and it's about kind of my career in tech and politics. And a guy named Jonathan Nee reviewed it for The Times, and Jonathan runs a program at Columbia Business School. And a few months later, I get an email from him saying, hey, would you want to teach this stuff here? And I was like, sure. So I just finished my 4th year doing it. It's a class called The Economics and Politics of Disruption. And it's literally what I do in my day job as a venture capitalist, which is, figuring out how do you invest in highly disruptive technologies, and then how do you legalize those technologies? And that may be, an Uber, an Airbnb, a FanDuel, where you're taking on an entrenched interest that's already in the economy and in society, and you've got to beat them. Or it may be in cryptocurrency or AI or drones or whatever it is, where there is no regulatory framework, there are no incumbents, but you've got to create something because you can't exist in an absolute vacuum of regulation and laws either. And so I give the students basically a fake startup, and it could be delivery drones, it could be autonomous trucks, it could be, telemedicine, whatever it is, and say, okay, you have to legalize this thing in these 3 states, and I pick different states based on the politics happening there right now. And then over the course of the semester, they develop a campaign plan where they show, okay, here's how we're going to use all the different tools of politics to actually make drone delivery legal, or autonomous trucking legal, or whatever it is. But half the semester are people in VC and tech coming in to sort of explain their side of the equation, and the half are people in politics coming to explain their side of the equation. And I try to sort of engage the real world stuff as much as possible. So, for example, we have mock press conferences, but because we're in New York City, real reporters come to ask the questions. We have mock legislative hearings, but real legislators come to participate in them. And then at the end of the semester, the students present their campaign plan for how they're going to, legalize self-driving trucks in Kansas or New Jersey or whatever it is. And, they learn at least how that whole world and process works. I don't think most of them are going to go into a career of doing that, because we're literally the only venture capital fund that does this, so there's not a lot of jobs in this space. But you work at Amazon, am I allowed to say it? Yep. Yeah. And you have a whole team of people there who do work on either side of the equation of either legalizing disruptive technology, or I think more often in your case, squashing disruptive technology, because you've become the monopoly and you don't want competition from new people. So either way, every tech company, every big company, has to be able to deal with this one way or another. So even if my students aren't working directly in that area, if they actually understand how it all works, they're going to be a lot better at their jobs.
I'll mention an interesting lawsuit that's going on with Amazon and the FTC right now. It's public information. Sure. So the premise of the lawsuit is the FTC is suing Amazon on the basis that their policies with vendors are set up in such a way where, because Amazon enforces that those vendors offer the most competitive pricing on Amazon, they're monopolizing the business by forcing these vendors to offer the best pricing on Amazon, and consumers are getting more entrenched.
Yeah. Yeah, I've been a big supporter of the FTC's litigation against Amazon. Actually, Lena Khan, who's the chair of the FTC, was here in this bookstore a couple of months ago, and we did an event together talking about things exactly like this. And the reason why I'm taking a position that a lot of people in tech feel is wrong, because it's sort of considered anti-tech, is I'm an early stage investor. I invest in seed and Series A companies. And there is no way I can invest in a company that's a potential competitor to Google or Amazon or Microsoft or Apple or Meta, simply because they have so much monopolistic power that they can squash any kind of competition. And the problem is this, and we're already starting to see this happening, some fraying at Google, which is every sort of innovative, disruptive, incredible company, as time goes by, just becomes a company, and they become bureaucratic, and they become stagnant, and they become political. If that weren't true, Standard Oil and IBM and Ford Motor Company and General Electric would be still be the big companies today, right? And they're not, because at the end of the day, people fade. And my big concern is when Amazon fades, and it eventually will, if because they're monopolistic power, no venture capitalists like me were able to invest in any potential competitors, then you're going to have this giant hole in the economy where you're no longer innovating in a way that is creating jobs and economic activity. And then the new companies who could step up and fill the void were never created, because Amazon had so much monopolistic power that they were able to deter any potential competition. And that's when you get into really failed economies. So I know I've taken a position that is unpopular in the tech world, but I truly believe that if you care about innovation and you care about this country's economy, it's the right position.
So I agree with you on that, but my hot take is that with the argument that the FTC brought forth on Amazon, they're not going to be able to win the case, and here's why. The whole, for people who are not familiar with the case, the whole argument hinges on the fact that Amazon is creating a monopoly. And Amazon came back to the FTC and said, well, it's not a monopoly at all, because a monopoly adversely affects the consumer. By lowering prices for our consumers, we're benefiting them. Right. So either we're going to have to redefine what we think of a monopoly to be, or the FTC is going to have to come back with a different argument to win. Yeah, look, I don't think the case is a slam dunk for the FTC at all. I'm glad they're bringing these cases, because I think that at least creates better behavior by the Amazons of the world. At least now, when you're going to do something that's monopolistic and anti-competitive, your general counsel says, no, wait, we're going to make our situation even worse. Don't do that. So I think there's a positive chilling effect. But yeah, now with that said, a lot of it is how you're defining the retail market for digital versus physical. Amazon, because they, Jeff Bezos did this unbelievably amazing job of creating this whole new category and really revolutionizing retail in many ways. There isn't a lot of case law or legislation or precedent around how you should look at a lot of these things. So in some ways, these cases are going to end up establishing the legal precedents that are then going to, dictate how this stuff plays out over the next 50, 100 years. Yeah, so maybe it's like a something is better than nothing.
Maybe, yeah. We'll see which way the court goes with it, and we'll also see, depending on the outcome of the election, if Trump wins, and the, latest New York Times poll would indicate that that's the likely outcome, you would think that he would be less interested in chasing down, monopolistic behavior. But Trump himself seemed very interested in using the FTC to go after anyone that he doesn't like personally. So who knows?
It'll be interesting to see. And speaking of which, the elections are coming up and very top of mind, I think, for everybody. What's something that you wish more average voters understood?
I wish average voters understood, and we talked this a little earlier, that ultimately politicians only make decisions based on what will keep them in office. 99% of politicians, and just to be clear, I've worked in city government, state government, federal government, the executive branch, the legislative branch. I've worked in government in Illinois, in New York, in Philadelphia, D.C. I've run campaigns in all 50 states. I've seen this thing from every conceivable angle. And 99% of politicians, in my experience, are desperately insecure, self-loathing people that can't live without the validation of holding office. It is the best job they'll ever have. For some of them, it's even the most money they'll ever make. And they will never, ever risk the thing that fills this void in their psyche and their soul just to do the right thing. If they would, we wouldn't have school shootings, right? And we do constantly. So rather than sort of this naive view of like, they should be better people, they're not going to be, right? This is human nature. This was probably the case in the Greek Senate and the Roman Senate and everything else. We see that Netanyahu is just as bad in Israel. Politicians make decisions that are good for them that may be in accordance with public policy or at the expense of it. They don't give a shit. They just care about getting reelected. So you've got to align the underlying political inputs with the policy outputs that you want. And because most voters, most people who listen to this podcast, when you post this, you may think you're a regular voter, but you're not. Because my guess is you very rarely, if ever, voted in your city council primary. You don't know who your state senator is. You don't know who your state rep is. You vote for president, maybe you vote for senator or governor once in a while, maybe mayor once in a while. But, that's just a small fraction of it. And in places like New York especially, everything's determined in the primary, right? So I'm an independent. I'm not allowed to vote in primaries. And my vote is effectively useless because in New York, the Democrat automatically wins every general election. So the vast majority of people who hold office in this country are determined in the primary, not the general election. And those people who actually do show up and vote are the only ones who have any relevance because they're the only ones that actually matter to the career and continuation in office of elected officials. And so rather than saying they should be better or just complaining, go vote in the primaries. Because if you do, and we have higher turnout, that shifts things to the middle. Like my brother-in-law happens to be a member of Congress from New Jersey. In fact, he's also a guy named Josh Gottheimer, who's one of the biggest pro-Israel supporters in Congress. And Josh has this incredible luxury, which is he represents one of the few remaining swing districts left in this country. And so he created this thing called the Problem Solvers Caucus in Congress, which is this bipartisan group that will work together to actually try to get things done. And they've been very effective on things like infrastructure and microchips and policing and things like that. Now, you know who hates Josh? The far left, because he dares to work with Republicans, because he dares to talk to people from the other side. Josh has the rare luxury of being able to do that because he has an election that actually does get determined in the general election, not in the primary. And so for him, he's able to govern in a really thoughtful way. But most people don't have that kind of luxury, right? And so I want every politician to have the ability to say, I'm only going to get reelected if I get shit done because I'm being held accountable by my constituents because the majority of them are not participating. And the way you get stuff done is by working together and compromise and consensus. And so at the end of the day, if you want to actually have an impact, you got to vote in primaries. I am trying to make it easier for you to do so by making mobile voting happen. But, that's a multi-year project and you kind of can't squander the present. So, next primary that comes up, like for example, for those of you who are listening to this from New Jersey, I assume you have some listenership there. Your primary is June 4th. You have a really big Senate primary between Andy Kim and Tammy Murphy, and one of those candidates is very pro-Israel, Tammy Murphy, and one much less so, Andy Kim. You want to elect the pro-Israel candidate, go vote in the primary.
Thanks so much for sharing that. I mean, I think people need to start showing up to the polls. And the very first guest that I brought on this podcast is Dana Levinson-Steiner, who's director of access at AJC. Mm-hmm. And she talked about, listen, if you want a pro-Israel government, go run for something.
Yeah. It's funny. So a friend of mine, a guy named Micah Lasher, is running for the assembly right now in New York on the Upper West Side. And Mike we worked in the Bloomberg world, really successful guy. And a bunch was like, are you out of your mind? Like, why would you want to go work in this like hole in Albany with all these idiots? And then it kind of hit me like, we're always complaining about our politicians. We're always complaining that good people don't run for office. Let's just support him, right? Because he is trying to do the right thing, and he's willing to sort of take some risk, and he's willing to make a lot less money than he could make in the private sector because he wants to try to do some good for his city and his state. And so, yeah, I think there are examples of people who do that. But again, even they have a hard time winning in primaries against ideologues and extremists. So, for example, Micah has a long history of working on behalf of education reform in New York City, supporting charter schools and things that really help take a failing system and make it better. You know who doesn't love Micah? The teachers' unions, right? And the people who vote in Democratic primaries on the Upper West Side tend to be rabidly pro-teachers' union. As a result, I still think Micah will pull it out. But, you know, because he has taken bold positions to try to actually do things in the world, and because so few people will vote in his primary, he's going to be really penalized for that. But if you ask the majority of people, like, do you care about having better schools, or do you care about only having schools that sort of work for one particular special interest over another? They would just say we want better schools, right? But you can't actually make those policies happen unless you're part of the process.
Okay, well, I have just a couple of questions left
Sure.
for you. You recently wrote an article on 50 pieces of life advice for your 50th birthday. Mm-hmm. What's just one piece of advice you would give?
Yeah, I mean, I think to me there's, so you can find it on my Substack, and I do think that I spent months and months and months working on it, so I do think that all 50 are at least thoughtful. You might disagree with them, but they're not ill-considered. But it's this. I've spent a lot of time studying happiness science, behavioral psychology, behavioral economics, because I've really been trying to figure out, like, what ultimately makes people happy, in part because I found with myself, look, I've had a lot of success. I've made a lot of money. I've held really big jobs. I get a lot of attention, all this stuff. And I still didn't necessarily feel happy, right? And I checked all the boxes you're supposed to check to be happy. And I was like, this ain't doing it. So I started really doing a lot of research to figure out, well, what does science say about this? What do the experts think? And fundamentally, it's two things. It's relationships and it's fulfillment. So do you know the Grant study at Harvard? So Harvard has done the longest longitudinal study in history, where I think it was 1934. They took a group of sophomores and then also a group of working class men in Boston and said, we are going to follow you for your entire life and figure out, basically what are the factors that make you happy and what are the factors that make you unhappy. And in terms of the outcomes, all over the board, right? You had Harvard guys that became homeless. You had working class guys that became really successful. JFK happened to be a sophomore at Harvard that year, so one of them became president. But what they ultimately determined, and they still now, most of them are dead, obviously, but they work with their families, is the people who had really close relationships with others, who said, okay, these are people who will always be there for me, and I will always be there for them, and I can count on them, and they can count on me. They were the happiest people, right? Not the people who made the most money, not the people with the most fame or the most Instagram followers or the best looking spouse or the fanciest car or all the other shit. By the way, a lot of stuff that our community, the Jewish community, wildly overvalues. Like, it doesn't really make a fucking difference where your kid goes to college. You mainly care about that so you could put the Harvard or Yale sticker on the back of your car and have your friends be impressed by you. That's not about the well-being of your kid, right? I have a senior in high school right now, so I'm in the middle of dealing with all of this stuff. And so fundamentally, what the Grant study found, and every subsequent study is confirmed, is pretty fucking obvious, which is relationships, good relationships, is part of what makes us happy. Another thing is fulfillment, right? So let's just take you as an example. You have a high-level job at Amazon. If you felt totally fulfilled by that job, you wouldn't have started this podcast, right? Because the vast, vast majority of podcasts don't make any money. So, like, statistically speaking, I have belief in you, but you'll probably not get rich from this thing. That's just sort of the way podcasts work. It's like, a handful of people who do and no one else. But you're doing it not because you want money. You're doing it because it will be fulfilling for you to be able to access people who you think have interesting things to say and to interview them and ask them questions and to get those thoughts and ideas out there into the world to try to provoke debate and ideas and discussion and then ultimately have some of that lead to change. You have to have fulfillment. You have to have meaning. And that can come through the work that you do. It could come through hobbies and volunteer activities. It could come through your faith. I mean, there's a lot of places that you can do it. But the lack of it, especially the people like, I don't know, your typical hedge fund manager who just thinks, well, if I max out on money and status, that's automatically all I need to do. And then there's so many of them that are unhappy because, like, at the end of the day, have you heard of the hedonic treadmill? The notion of the hedonic treadmill is you can buy more and more and more stuff, but you're just on a treadmill. You're never actually going to kind of reach true happiness with it, because every fancy thing you buy, you get used to it faster and faster, and then you need something even fancier the next time and fancier the time after that. You can't beat it, right? It's a cycle that's historically, undefeated. And so you can't base your happiness on, I made partner at Goldman Sachs. I bought this huge house in Great Neck. I sent my 3 kids to Ivy League schools. I drive a Ferrari, or whatever it is, all the nonsense, again, that I think the Jewish community, especially in and around New York, and in the U.S. generally speaking, tends to wildly overvalue. Yeah, look, the science is clear. You have to have enough money to have security, right? You have to have a place to live. You have to have food. You have to have clothing. You have to be able to afford your utilities. You have to have a certain measure of economic security for sure. But what most of the happiness studies show is the benefit becomes incremental after a certain level of income. Not to say that more money isn't better than less money. I have more money than I used to, and that lets me do more things with it, like mobile voting, like hunger, like this incredibly money-losing bookstore, or whatever else. But fundamentally, that in and of itself, isn't going to do the trick. And so I think that if you understand that the 2 things that you need most in life are fulfillment and relationships, and you focus your efforts on that, you're going to achieve happiness. And my prediction is you'll probably also end up achieving more material success as well, because the people who are happy tend to be more effective. Other people want to be around them. Other people want to work with them. Other people like them. You're a better salesperson as a result of it, and everything else. But I really do think that we are frequently taught the wrong values that not only don't lead to happiness, but often produce us great disappointment because they're sort of the opposite of it. And so to me, if you read through the whole 50 Reflections at 50 piece, there's a lot more in there than that. But I think if there's one takeaway, that's it.
Thanks so much for sharing that. I completely agree. As someone who studied behavioral science at Penn.
Yeah.
A side note, nothing makes my parents more proud than to say, oh, my daughter, she went to Penn.
Right. So I went to Penn as well. And I went there in part because my mom really wanted me to go to a school like that. And I didn't really know enough to know kind of what was right for me and what I wanted. And she was trying to just do what was best for me. But at the same time, she wanted to be able to say, my son goes to Penn. And it was the wrong environment for me completely, right? It was just like the epitome of everything that I just said doesn't produce happiness. Penn is organized around those principles, right? And in fact, my sister, who I think in the ultimate act of sort of rebellion, turned down Yale for college and Harvard for law school mainly to piss off my mom, simply because she knew that my mom would be able to say, well, my daughter's at Yale, my daughter's at Harvard Law School, would make her so happy for the wrong reasons. And my sister's like, I'm not doing that, and didn't do either of them. So, yeah, but that's, to me, it's the wrong priority. So I've got a daughter who's a senior in high school, and look, she's gotten some good schools, but all of the effort that we've put in terms of touring campuses and trying to help her figure out where to go has been around, like, where do you think you would like the people the most? You like the values the most? You can study things that you find interesting and useful. The geography that you want to be in a type of school and a type of campus and a size, everything else that you think works for you. And that's what you need to do, not whether it's number 17 on the list or 34 or 51 or 68 or 85 or anything else.
Agreed. Okay, as we wrap up here, just a couple more questions for you. What's a political issue or trend that's keeping you up at night right now, and why? Do you think we can solve it?
Yeah, so I think social media would be my answer to that question. I do think it's solvable. I believe that social media is effectively the unhappiness machine. It does 2 things to people. The first thing it does is it forces you to compare your life to a fictitious version of someone else's, right? And as a result, you feel inadequate almost immediately. And that's true for almost all of us, because anyone can construct whatever sort of alternate reality they want online. And even though you may understand intellectually that a lot of that's nonsense, you still emotionally can't help it. You see someone that looks so happy, having this great time, this amazing vacation or whatever it is, and you're like, oh, their life is so much better than mine. And then the other thing the internet does, or social media does, is it shows you everything bad happening everywhere in the world all at once, right? And so, it's not to say that there aren't lots of bad things that happen in this world, but they are so magnified by what we see online. And we as human beings have this thing called negativity bias, which is just an evolutionary trait that we develop because ultimately, you study behavioral psychology, so you know this, like we would be eaten by lions if we didn't develop this, early on in life. But we still have it, which means that we are far more conditioned psychologically to click on negative content than positive content. And so what do the platforms serve us up? As much toxic and negative content as they possibly can, because if you are Mark Zuckerberg, your only goal is to maximize revenue coming into Facebook. You don't care what the societal costs of that are. And so you know that if you feed people the nastiest, most toxic stuff possible, that's going to make you the most money. And that's what he does, and that's what Twitter does, and that's what TikTok does, and that's what Google does, YouTube, and every other platform as well. As a result, social media produces tremendous unhappiness, but at the same time, it is so ingrained in our lives. Look, I'm not on social media, but I'm in a position where I'm 50 years old. I have a lot of independence financially, politically, personally. I don't have to be, right? But my kids, they couldn't run their lives and know what their friends are up to and everything else without being on Snap and TikTok and everything else. And so it is so enmeshed into so many people's lives that while the best thing we could probably do, it's funny, you and I were joking right before we started recording, because you said Instagram and Facebook and YouTube and some other platforms are down. And I'm like, great, every minute they're down is a better minute for the world. But in reality, they're not going to go away. But here's what we could do, which is there's a law called the Communications Decency Act. It was passed in 1996 by Congress, and one of its provisions said that internet platforms cannot be sued for the content posted by its users. And the reason why that made a lot of sense back in 1996 is the internet was brand new, right? Just getting off the ground. I remember my first experience with email was like in 94 at Penn. University sort of started trying it out a little bit. And you needed for these platforms to get off the ground to have enough legal protection to be able to sort of experiment and try out new ideas and everything else. I don't think any of us could have envisioned what it morphed into, but that same legal protection still exists today, close to 30 years later. And as a result, Meta can push all the most negative content they want, and they face no liability whatsoever, so that's what they do. So, for example, do you remember when Dominion, the voting system, sued Fox successfully about a year or two ago because Fox had made claims that the Dominion machines were rigged in the 2020 election? Fox had to pay $800 million in a settlement because Fox doesn't have the liability protection that Twitter has, right? And so as a result, they are much less likely to make the same untrue, salacious claims next time around because they just learned the $800 million lesson. Those same claims were magnified on Instagram and Twitter and TikTok and every other platform, but those platforms, which made plenty of money on it, got away scot-free because they can't be held liable. So repealing Section 230, which is the provision, to me is the most critical thing that we could do to fix this. What's so frustrating about it is everyone agrees, right? So Biden and Trump had one issue in 2020 that they both totally agreed on. It was repealing Section 230. Biden in the State of the Union talked about repealing Section 230. We see all these hearings in Congress all the time where they, make the social media leaders come and beg for forgiveness, and then nothing changes. Why? Because the platforms at the end of the day have so much political power, and because, as we discussed twice now in this podcast, every policy output shapes every political input, and what the politicians know is when I run for my next reelection, only the primary is going to matter, and only 10% of people are going to vote. And if Facebook or Snap or Instagram or Twitter, whoever, X, wherever they are now, drops $1 million against me in that primary, I'm going to lose. So whether it's their fear of the money or because the platforms have done a great job hiring the kids of politicians and family members and sort of giving them a personal economic incentive to maintain the system the way it is, or whatever else, we have this system where we have this thing that we know is bad for us. We know makes us unhappy. Everyone agrees on it, especially when it comes to protecting kids online. I would say, as the parent of two teenagers, it doesn't matter what your politics are, right? You could be a crazy MAGA person. You could be a crazy socialist, whatever it is. You're still fucking terrified about what your kids are finding on the internet. If your kids are like 4, you have some level of control over it. But once they hit a certain age, especially once COVID came and school and internet all got merged into the same thing, parents lost control completely. And so that's the single most important, I think, thing that can be done. You do see states like New York right now has a bill that would take some measures to try to protect minors, and Texas and California, a lot of states are working on it. But it's really going to take federal legislation for it to work and to be legally binding.
Something I wanted to add to what you said is I work in ad tech, which of course deals with privacy and protecting consumers.
Yep.
And COPA, the law that protects children from advertisement, is always a hot topic of debate.
Sure.
And I remember I used to work at a company that sells identity graphs, which are just sets of data about every marketable consumer in the U.S. So that's like your name, your address, your phone number, your email, your mobile ad ID, your IP address. Completely legal to sell to other companies for the purposes of advertisement so that they can reach you. And I remember doing a pitch to a Russian company. This was before the war in Ukraine. And the guy asked me why I quoted him that there are only 240 million marketable consumers in the U.S. when there are a lot more. And that's a standard question that you get. And I said, well, of course, we don't count the deceased that passed that year if we're aware of them. And we remove children because it's illegal to market to children. To which he said, it's only illegal if they can prove you knew they were children.
Right. That's the problem.
So we have a long way to go in that regulation. You're not the first to talk about Section 230.
Yeah. So hopefully at some point politics shift on this thing and it can get done.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for doing this.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me.
As we wrap up here, what's the best way to keep up with you on social media? Yeah,
so as I mentioned before, I'm actually not on social media. I do have a LinkedIn profile, so you can follow that. But sort of every week, this is a little Luddite, but we send out a newsletter with the podcast I recorded that week, whatever my column might be, articles that we're in that are interesting in some way. And so if you just go to firewall.media, you can sign up for it. It's free. And then every week you can get an email with all the relevant things we're working on, and it'll help you know what we're doing.
Awesome. And last question for you. It's one that I ask every single guest. Who would you like to nominate for the podcast?
So it's a little circular. So you, I think, learned of me because you heard me on Michael Eisenberg's podcast. Michael is a VC in Israel. I would argue the best VC in Israel, and both a friend of mine and a colleague of mine. And I would say that I know, because I've had Michael on my podcast multiple times, he's a great podcast host, but he's also a great podcast guest. And so I would highly recommend getting Michael to come on. And I think what's so great about him as a guest is he can give you a really good sense of what's happening on the ground in Israel right now, and that's really helpful. But he also can give you a sense of technology and venture capital. He grew up in New York City, so he has kind of the perspective of an American Jew living in Israel. So he brings a lot of different perspectives to a conversation, so I think he'd be a great guest.
Thanks. I love that nomination. I'm a huge fan of Michael, and I actually, when I used to be a Hebrew school teacher in Philadelphia, I taught his book to my fourth grade students.
Oh, which one? He's written a couple.
The Tree of Life.
Yeah,
Principles,
sure.
The book on principles. I taught them about how Noah was the world's first entrepreneur. They found that fascinating.
Yep.
Otherwise, they're bored to death. So his book's great for that.
Yeah, if you can make Hebrew school interesting, you're doing something right.
Yeah, thanks. Well, thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Know.
Okay, take care. Bye.
If you've enjoyed this podcast, please go ahead and rate us 5 stars. Be the first to hear our episodes by subscribing to People You Want to Know wherever you get your podcasts. And for exclusive content, follow us on Instagram at People You Want to Know.